today I'm joined with Ed Pocock, Global Head of Cybersecurity at Gallagher Re. This is obviously an interesting vantage point in the market when looking at how reinsurers are looking at systemic risk. Really appreciate you joining us for the cyber incident room. Again, I think, and please do sort of add to this, I think the picture that we want to create for this incident room is understanding, how big a loss can get when it comes to cyber risk and what can you do about it in real time? How can you sort of pre-predict and see the risk environment growing? And that I want to be the basis of our scenario that we'll talk through. But to start it off, what I'd love, as you are the expert in the room, is to sort of talk me through what happens when a systemic event lands and give the audience a bit of a picture about your role within Gallagher Re and what you're doing at the moment.
Yeah, sure. So, first of all, thank you.
Happy
to be here. Secondly, yes, our incident room looks a little bit different than the incident room for CISOs or those in similar types of roles. But there is a similarity. I think the similarity is time pressure and probably stress levels. So kind of stepping back a second, cyber makes headlines, and the same type of loss in property by sort of pure financial scale that wouldn't make a back page makes headline news in cyber. But it's not always the events that have a disproportionate impact for the insurance industry that are the ones that make headlines. So there is a thriving sort of threat intelligence community, and yes, cyber does attract big headlines, but quite often the events that we've seen really affect insurance portfolios are the ones that don't really get much airtime at all. Okay. So there is an important role, I think, for kind of threat intelligence that focuses on portfolio risk or systemic risk, and for insurers. So what does that look like for us? When an event lands, there's a lot of uncertainty, and what we try and do is get a perspective out in 36 hours that is accurate and nuanced, that says what's happened, why has it happened.
And that's when the panic hits, I'm guessing.
Exactly. No, it's all calm. It's all calm here. How bad is it going to be, and what's the implication for different insurance products and services? At the same time, we're going out to our clients, insurers, and we're having conversations who in their portfolio might be impacted. Quite often the insurers there have a window of opportunity, probably about sort of 36, 48 hours to get in contact with their insureds, particularly for some of these systemic events where your response can be relatively standardized across your portfolio, and support them in sort of understanding what's happening. Potentially that then insulates them from some of the attrition they might otherwise have, and yes, sometimes the severity of some of these losses as well.
Mm-hmm. And where do you think, when we're looking at sort of different lines of insurance, where do you think cyber differs when you're going through that process, as opposed to sort of like more traditional lines of insurance?
Hurricanes don't learn. So I think for insurers, we are constantly on this treadmill of attacks change, the threat changes, the techniques being used by threat actors change. And so the controls that we need to have in place and the way in which we respond to these events needs to constantly change over time. So there is no kind of fixed, you can batten down the hatches, and the same sort of things that protect you from a tropical storm now are going to be the same sort of things in 50 years, pending sort of new innovations and that sort of thing. It's not the same for cyber. So the role for the insurance industry to support insureds in getting ahead of that is probably, we can probably have more agency.
No, that's interesting. And I guess before we go into sort of the incident room scenario, I would love to sort of understand your perspective and your attitude when looking at claims data and loss patterns. So over the last 12, 24 months, what are you seeing emerge that hasn't yet sort of made it into the market's pricing and thinking? As you said, there's major headlines. Yeah. But what maybe isn't appearing in those headlines, or even just like the conversations that you're having with the market privately or over a pint?
So, we're a reinsurance broker, right? And as a result, we found ourselves in this weird position where we probably have the least worst set of incident data out there. People don't typically share when they've had a loss, but they do share with their insurers. And so we capture a lot of that claims data. we've spent over the past 5 years time kind of building a machine learning model and refining that model to say at the point of underwriting, which bits of data have value in predicting what types of cyber events for different types of company, by revenue, by industry, by country, and why. You know, and so we started off with one provider, and it's kind of ballooned, and it's a bit of a time commitment for providers. But essentially, if you're a cyber data vendor, you too are lacking the data to determine what of my data is useful at predicting different types of losses. So it's valuable for them in determining their kind of research and development strategies. Same for insurers, right? You want to rely on this type of data. Often it's more frictionless to use in underwriting. You don't need to ask the company for access to certain data. So in using the results of this analysis in tandem with some of these data sets, our hope is that our clients and markets can have more confidence in using this data to price risk, using this data to understand their portfolio quality before the underwriting results start coming in, and to kind of identify potential concentration risks and diversification opportunities. So that's the background. To answer your question sort of more directly, we are just scratching the surface on this data. I think a lot of the focus traditionally has been on things like patching cadence and port security and all of the things you might have heard about. You know, what we found actually interestingly with patching cadence is some of the vendors, their patching cadence scores are really interestingly predictive of different types of loss, but actually for many of them they're not. If we take BitSight, for example, that's one score that does look like it's predictive, but they take a factor over the last 3 months. If we expand it and look over the past year and take the worst day, which is ultimately what an insurer cares about, right? Policy year, that seems to have a lot more signal. But the big kind of unexplored area where there's a lot of opportunity, particularly where we are currently in the market cycle, is attack surface, digital attack surface. So looking at, and we spend a lot of time as an industry looking at what type of organization are we insuring by revenue, how much money are they making. I was going to say,
it's very like sector based, like what are you seeing in the retail market, the manufacturing market? Does that change, sort of upset things when looking at it from a systemic point of view or modelling?
It's a blunt instrument. And the other one is, we spend a lot of time as well looking at kind of the risk factors in place. What controls do you have as a business to prevent this from happening? We don't actually spend much time looking at quantifying the insured object, right? What buildings am I actually insuring? So when we look at kind of IP account, how many IP addresses are visible as an organization, interestingly, there's very little overlap there with revenue. So they're telling us different stories. Revenue, incredibly useful, incredibly predictive, but so too is IP count at giving you a view of the size of a company. And so if you've got a company with a massive revenue and a small IP count, that actually probably looks relatively attractive, particularly compared to the converse. Similarly, if you look at geography, you might get a picture of where a company is incorporated, but you're not necessarily going to say where are the buildings that I'm insuring housed in practice. So you may have an American company, but actually everything you're insuring is based in the Middle East. So there is a diversification opportunity as well for insurers and reinsurers to say, well, actually, this looks more like a Middle Eastern risk for my portfolio. There's a whole host of different factors there. If you're looking at number of ISPs, for instance, number of internet service providers can give us a view of the geographic complexity of an organization. So hopefully the takeaway here is we really are just scratching the surface on this data set.
And what do you think needs to sort of change within the sector to be more open to looking at like maybe more discrete angles of defining what someone's cyber risk looks like?
It's confidence. It is confidence. The kind of gap between the data's there, the data needs to be a little bit more in a format that we can be getting actionable insights from. And a big focus for us, right, has been sort of translating that work we've been doing into a service offering that can support our clients, in an actionable way to get these benefits. But it needs to be beyond us alone, right? And so it's trust and confidence in this data, and it's the time between where we are now and realizing that trust.
Yeah, no, interesting. And I'm sure the confidence comes as the days go by, right? So let's get into the incident room itself. I think the best way to look at this is to talk me through the examples of Striker and Azure, and I feel like you can also explain that to our listeners as well, what that means when I say that. What made those particular examples interesting to insurers? There was a lot of, when Striker came out, there was a lot of discussions in the market and the sector around it. And how, if you could talk through Striker and then Azure, how they unfolded, what does that mean for cyber insurance and the cyber risk sector now?
So Striker was a Iranian-aligned hacktivist group. And what they did was use the way that organizations have had to take their security approach against them. That's why this is such an interesting event. Essentially, flashback 15 years. Typically, a lot of organizations' data was in a server room. It was within their own network. Now, organizations, particularly larger ones, are much more a diaspora of connected software as a service solutions with data hosted on a myriad of third parties. A lot of your core data as an organization will be in the cloud, maybe hosted by Azure or someone else. Fundamentally different risk that we are writing today than we were 15 years ago. To manage that risk, organizations have had to gain visibility across this diaspora. And they do that with apps like Intune, which was the app that was used against Striker.
Right.
That visibility that Striker had of their organization, of their device estate, was used against them by the attacker. So the attacker logged in, they didn't use any malware, and they just deleted about 200,000 devices. They stole 50 terabytes of data, reportedly, and caused essentially business to stop functioning for 50,000 odd employees. This was a wiperware event, but without the ware. Mm-hmm. It's interesting because it's the first time we've seen this at scale. It's interesting because it can be replicated in the future. And typically we see new techniques be proven in a big, bold, brash event like this, similar to NotPetya, and then copied by other attackers. But I also think this event is something that AI could be well aligned to do itself, right? At a speed that humans will need AI to be stopping.
It started a new trend that could really grow quite quickly now that they've done it.
Exactly. So it's probably not the last of these types of events we're going to see. By the way, I don't think this invalidates any of the parameters in our catastrophe models. It's just going to be maybe the way that we see more attacks going in 27, 28, 29.
Yeah, and it's something that you guys can learn from and just like adapt certain models based on this particular example.
Exactly.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. When we're looking at organizations that are as big and impactful as companies like AWS, what does that mean for cyber risk vulnerabilities and organizational vulnerabilities across the whole value chain? And I mean this more in terms of like third-party risk. Are there examples that you've seen that might mean there needs to be something to change across the whole sector and across the whole sort of like global landscape when it comes to security?
Yeah, so I mean, my previous example was more having that product-based understanding of the of AWS and the other large cloud service providers. It's probably going to bring down our view of how bad the catastrophe event could be. AI is obviously changing things, and AWS is taking this on as part of its estate as well. it's seen a few hiccups here. I think there was reports of a production server being deleted by an AI tool. And when the AI tool was asked, why have you done this? It said, I don't know. I shouldn't have done that, but I've deleted it now.
Too late.
Too late. So there will be some teething problems, but I shouldn't imagine these will have an impact in the short term that will change the assumptions that we're making currently as an industry in this space. Now, secondly, all of the work that we have done as an industry to understand cloud risk is still relevant for AI risk as well.
Okay,
so
it's not like, we've got to start again.
It's exactly the same. Ultimately, particularly these large proprietary US models, they're all hosted in cloud services. So everything that we've done, takes us some way towards understanding that as well.
Okay, so it's a step by step, and I think that moves me quite nicely into, from a perspective of a non-expert on AI, on cyber, on insurance. Can you cut through some of the jargon for me when we talk about AI risk and what that actually looks like through your lens, but also everyone's lens? I think there's so much noise out there around AI. Could I get your sort of simplified take on it or realistic take on it?
Sure. Every industry is having to adopt AI fast and secure at the moment. And that alone is a real challenge for execs to manage. How do we navigate this fundamental shift in the way that we may work?
Yeah.
But insurance has it doubly hard, right? Because on top of that, we have to figure out what is our appetite for covering AI risk? Where is exposure at the moment? And AI is creating new, potentially uninsured risks that don't map cleanly over existing coverage areas. I think for cyber, this gives us a big opportunity, right? Because cyber's got a problem. We have a penetration problem. And that's bizarre. When you look at any insert Big Four here, insert Boston Consulting CEO, what are the biggest risks for you? And they say cyber is a big risk for us. We care about it. They say AI is a big risk for us, and they might say something else, geopolitics or something.
How legitimate is that comment?
Well, it's bizarre because then you map back for SMEs in particular. Cyber events are an existential concern for these SMEs, and yet many of them aren't buying cyber insurance. So why not? Is it that we are not meeting the buyer where they are as an industry, perhaps? Is it that we are not articulating a product clearly enough or not specializing enough with certain things? Possibly. And so I think AI doubles down on the value proposition of cyber, right? Because we are going to be capturing, to some extent, I would imagine, the business outage concerns from AI tools that are load-bearing for an entity. We are going to be capturing confidentiality, what happens when that AI tool sort of spews data into the unknown. And we're going to be capturing some of the integrity concerns with AI. The aforementioned, I've deleted your database, sorry about that. We're not capturing so much the robots gone rogue element, that the kind of emerging AI liability market captures. But for organizations, the importance is going to be leveraging the expertise that you have in cyber of digital risk and really bringing that to bear in this space so that you can sort of have a nuanced view of what this risk looks like and confidence to price it. For cyber, it also presents a challenge. And if we kind of cast our minds back to 2017, this was the kind of root cause of the ransomware epidemic that we saw with events like WannaCry and NotPetya that happened that year. What were the ingredients that made those events possible? Three things. First of all, a lower barrier to entry for sophisticated exploits. And so there, the kind of the Russian shadow brokers released a cache of exploits that the NSA had been using into attackers' hands overnight. They had the ability to play with these nation state level exploits. So secondly, it was the scalability. So NotPetya made it clear that wormable malware could infect a vast global network in seconds. Before that, yes, there was wormable malware, but it was far less common, and
easier to detect, I'm guessing, as well.
it was just less productionized, really. I think, typically if you had ransomware, it would be one device or a cluster of devices that were affected. Eternal Blue, one of those exploits that have been released as part of that cache, was the exploit that was used in both WannaCry and NotPetya, and really made that whole thing possible. So lower barrier to entry, scale, and then finally it was low operational friction. So cryptocurrency meant that attackers didn't have to meet each other on beaches with a briefcase of dollar bills anymore. They could facilitate payments with a lot less likelihood of getting caught. If you look at what AI is going to do, it's kind of presenting some similar ingredients. So lower barrier to entry in terms of giving exploits and the ability to find vulnerabilities to attackers with less friction. Secondly, scalability. It is making attacks more scalable for attackers, or will. And then third and finally, it's decreased operational friction. You don't have to hire someone to negotiate ransom payments anymore when you can rely on an AI tool to do it for you. So this is a transition that the industry is going to have to navigate. And I think a bit of an arms race going on at the moment, but over time, we saw last time with the ransomware epidemic how quick businesses were to respond, right, to put in the controls that matter. We're going to see the same thing here, and defenders are always going to have more frictionless access to top tier models to defend with. But we might see a little bit of an imbalance for a time period for certain types of businesses or businesses that are struggling to get ahead of the curve there.
Yeah, and do you think the bit that I'm intrigued by is effectively an attacker operates as a business, right? AI tools are not cheap. And so how much willingness do you think there'll be in the future, and not even just willingness, but ability to use AI at such a large scale when the cost of doing that for an attacker is so great in some cases?
You're absolutely right. It's not economical today. And if we look at the UK's AI Security Institute, right, and this is a kind of jewel of the UK at the moment. They are probably the gold standard in a nation state evaluation of different models for different use cases. So they have two benchmarks, one of which is called the last ones. This maps out the ability of models to compromise and right the way through to sort of attack on objective, action on objective, an undefended corporate network. So 34 steps, and it says how many tokens do they spend for each one. So it's the only evidence we have of Mythos Preview up against the other models at the moment for cyber use cases. And it shows Mythos Preview coming in at about $12,500 for a successful attack, again, against an undefended corporate network with
assuming
frictionless
no barriers
access
to entry.
Exactly.
Wow, that's a lot.
It is a lot. And GPT 5.5 Cyber does exactly the same thing at almost parity for $9,000. So yes, there's been a lot of focus on Mythos, but we also already have a model out in this space of kind of comparable power. The other evaluation that they do is for a cooling tower, so it's more kind of industrial control systems orientated. That's a 7-step event, and the average cost is around $25,000 for Mythos there at the moment. So
with the assumption that you're successful, or
with the assumption that you're successful, yes. And this is again largely undefended. So these models, yes, they hold promise. Yes, at some point, attackers are going to have access to Mythos level capabilities, probably in the next 9 months to a year. But we have a window to see this coming and to prepare for this. And also, by that point, defenders will have access to even more powerful models and more powerful capabilities, and they'll have less friction in accessing them. And for attackers, there's no guarantee that that's going to be economical for quite some time. So if we look at the newly released GLM 5.2 from ZAI, a Chinese model, it's touted as being 1/10 of the cost per token of the US frontier models, and it is really powerful, right? It's coming in ahead of the Google models.
Powerful and accurate as well.
let's get on to model evaluation in a second. But
jumping ahead.
No, it's foreshadowing. It's all good. But I think what's maybe not spoken about is how many tokens does it need to get to the result that we need. And if you look at that, then it's roughly at parity with the American models in terms of, the actual cost to solution.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So, there's a lot of things that are at play, and it's not as, I'm getting from what you're saying, that it's not as terrifying as potentially the headlines make it seem.
No, this is a manageable risk that we have time to look at and plan for.
Yeah, no, always good to know. And I think, as I've slightly hinted at, I'm keen to understand more on the work you've been doing to sort of like pick into assessing AI agent risk in particular. And I know we've spoken about this outside of this format, but there's a lot of talk about like the human in the loop with an autonomous system. Can you break that down for us and just explain what you're seeing around AI autonomous agents? There was a very interesting report that you put out the other day as well, which I think really, from my side, something that I can pick from it is you mentioned a lot about like insurers looking at uncertainty rather than risk, and what does that mean for the sector?
So I think if there's one takeaway from the report, it should be that actually AI can be boring, and that's probably what the insurance industry wants it to be. But
insurers have a good habit of being able to do
Well,
that.
yeah, absolutely. Let's make it boring. Less mythos, less excitement, more sort of manageable risk. And so we had a look at what are the prerequisites for us to really price this risk with confidence. And that all hinges on model evaluation. We've already touched on it. These are benchmarks that show us how well models perform for different things. And there's a number of issues here at the moment. This industry is not working in the way that insurance needs it to be working. And so the purpose of the report is to say, hey, insurance, if we dive headfirst into this, we can have a seat at the table in what AI becomes. And if we look at AI model evaluation approaches, a lot of it is focused currently on peak performance, right? How powerful can this model be? What we actually want to understand, and I think honestly what insureds want to understand, and what businesses need to understand from their model providers as well, is how does this model behave on a day-to-day basis? How does this model behave against different use cases specifically, like the cyber one we mentioned earlier? And how does this model fail? Not just does it fail or refusal rate, but how does it fail?
Okay, so not going how many times a year would this like drop?
Yeah, you want to know how often it fails as well, but more important than knowing how often it fails is knowing when it does fail, how big is the blast radius going to be? How bad is it going to be? And this is currently something that the models struggle to capture. So let's look back at kind of OpenAI's release of GPT 4.0 or 4.0. That was, for anyone that used it, recognized it had a sycophancy issue. So it would say, oh, aren't you right? You're amazing. Have I told you you're amazing? And when you said to it, hang on, you're just agreeing with me, that was inaccurate, it would say, oh, you've done it again. You're great. You understand all of this stuff. And so it was obvious to anyone that used it, but because models were being evaluated on an empirical basis, it wasn't being picked up. And there's some other limitations of this approach as well. One of them is the saturation of these benchmarks. So models learn to perform to the test. And when you're testing models against certain things, first of all, they might know they're being tested. And that's a challenge for the new Mythos models. They might not even say in their reasoning that they're aware that they're being tested.
How do you then work out?
It's a challenge.
That's so complicated.
But when you know what you're being tested on, you might ingest that into your training material. And so we see quite often these new benchmarks going from sort of 0% to 98, 99% and being saturated on just not being useful anymore within a couple of years. So it's a real important one for us to keep designing new evaluation criteria and approaches that keep testing models in as kind of accurate way as possible. Also, if we're just looking at peak performance, we're going to see a homogenization of models. If you look at the most powerful Claude models on the market at the moment, Opus 4.8. For many people utilizing that, particularly for abstract reasoning, you might see that as a backward step. So it's a different infrastructure than Opus 4.6, for instance. If you're using it for coding or mathematical considerations or agentic tooling, you're going to find it more consistent, more powerful. But it thinks and speaks a little bit more like an auditor, which is in the interest of a company that is got an IPO incoming, but potentially not in the interest of those using it for some of those kind of abstract reasoning or more creative purposes. So we probably don't want too much of a homogenization of these models. The third one is concentration risk, right? So looking at this empirical peak performance doesn't capture the kind of concentration risks inherent with some of these models and these new model versions, where businesses, you come in on Monday morning, you've got a new model version in the back of Copilot. Yeah, we're not testing these for months, and they quite often they think in different ways. It's like having a different employee at a desk. And then the final challenge that we highlighted there was the guardrails challenge, right? And not just looking at refusal rates, but looking at failure states can help us get more comfort over. Guardrails are going to be a trade-off because there is no model that has been released yet where the guardrails are perfect. And it looks like that's never going to be achievable.
I was going to say, is that possible for any of the companies?
Hence the restricted access. And our report argued that that's not necessarily a good thing for insurers, because you are taking the model out of the hands of those that you need to be able to evaluate this for different use cases and price this risk effectively.
You can't test what the potential problem will be if no one's allowed access to it, but it does still exist out in the realm of possibility.
Exactly. And for the what's happened more recently, past the date that we published the report, was the US taking Mythos 5 or Fable 5, both of them off the menu entirely. And that has taken it out of the hands of the likes of the UK AI Security Institute, who we've kind of identified as the gold standard in sort of giving us a view of how different models are performing at the moment. I'd like to kind of just say there is a parallel here, right? So 1970s, the US is publishing some great research on new cryptographic algorithms. And they then say, okay, this is a munition. We're going to classify it as a munition, and we're going to kind of constrain how far this information gets out. That even took it off, it restricted the access to the likes of the UK and other US allies. In the long term, though, it just had an impact of putting US industry at a disadvantage against competitors, because other countries were incentivized to build their own capabilities off the back of it. And as we know, for AI, the maths is out there. Everyone's got access to this. GPT 5.5 Cyber seems to show relative parity, and there's no restriction on that. So, business.
Do you think it's fair to say, like, keep your friends close and your enemies closer? That sort of can apply to AI in terms of how we use it and learn from it, or it's not quite the same?
I think it's just a fast-moving field, right? The Chinese frontier models are about 9 months behind the American frontier models. The open weight models are about a year to 18 months behind the frontier models. So this probably gets us closer towards a state that is actually beneficial to insurance, right? Where if everyone is incentivized to build their own, then we're not going to be creating these types of concentration risks where we're reliant on 3 proprietary model providers in the US that, if they have an outage or a model gets switched off, it can have significant impacts to a large swathe of companies and their ability to function, or even at an economic level. What we might see is more incentivization towards a thriving ecosystem of open weight models where, let's say a Gallagher has an open weight model that is developed for our own purposes, that is hosted on our own servers, that long term probably looks like more of an attractive risk to an insurer than, particularly at a portfolio level, than reliance on a very small number of companies. But I think in the short term, there is an allure to insurers of saying, big US proprietary company, the guardrails are going to be a little bit better for now. Let's give a pricing dividend to anyone relying on a Claude model or relying on a GPT model. I think in the long term, that presents a lot of risks to us as an industry and probably walks us into greater concentration risk than we would have otherwise.
So at this stage, is it sensible then for companies that are looking at underwriting AI risk to be overly cautious and potentially avoidant, or it's about getting ahead and being ready for in the 6 to 12 months time when there's a better grasp of what that risk looks like, you've already started looking at it as an insurer and a carrier?
I think we've already identified that this is not a systemic risk at the moment. It's not load bearing for companies today in a way that it will be at some point. So insurers have a window of opportunity to get into this area, to understand it, to kind of really lead the field in it, so that by the time it becomes a load-bearing risk for businesses, they have a grasp on it to be able to price it with a confidence that maybe others wouldn't.
Yeah, not shy away from it, basically.
Exactly.
And as you said, it's boring, so get involved.
and what we need as an industry from better model evaluation essentially is parity in how we kind of can look at the capability of different models to different use cases between sort of some of these proprietary models and the open weight ones. We need to be assessing these models over time, not just how they perform on day one, they drift. And we need to be identifying some of the concentration risks inherent to them as well.
And to that then, so how can those that care about the portfolio risk get ahead of this? I know we slightly touched on it. And what would you say, would you say the biggest concentrations are at this very moment in time?
So again, it's not necessarily load bearing today in a way that it will be. So I think the concentration risks are forming, but they're not there yet. As we saw, it's a tomorrow problem in terms of the financial element of this as well. So AI is going to be being used by threat actors today in a lot of events. But is it going to be the reason why that event takes place? Or is it going to make that event fundamentally different than it would have been otherwise? Probably not in the majority of cases. For tomorrow, though, I think it's probably a fool's errand for insurers looking at the current sort of CyberCube scenarios or the other modeled scenarios and just changing the numbers to reflect AI risk. We need to understand how could these scenarios be different than the scenarios of yesteryear. Then we can say, what is the footprint like? And then we can look at the numbers. And we probably need to be looking at those numbers for across different lines rather than just cyber. So for the industry as a whole, where could these losses occur? How bad could it get? And the one difference where I think these events are going to look different probably isn't for malicious events. It's probably more the unintended consequences. So it is more new version of GPT on a Monday morning in Copilot does something or responds to some of the agentic tooling in a way that is unforeseen and causes a loss for businesses, either through information being made available publicly, database deletions en masse. We could see a whole host of different things there. Again, this is not a today problem, it's a tomorrow problem, and we've got time to build those things, but we need to be building those scenarios from the ground up rather than relying on some of the structures that we've got in place.
And do you think cyber as a line is best placed to sort of lead the way for this, or are there other lines that are also looking at AI with the same amount of like interest and readiness?
The risk will probably sit across multiple lines long term. It's unclear where that's going to or how that's going to unfold. But the understanding of the risk and the expertise, both from an analytics standpoint and from a security standpoint, comes from cyber or is housed in cyber at the moment. So the organizations with that expertise already are going to be best placed to do this. They just need to put that team in a position where they can harness it to get an understanding of this emerging risk as well.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I wanted to close with, because we were in the incident room, we're looking at all of, as you said, everything we've touched on, from AI risks to more like just advanced traditional attacks. If you could imagine sitting in front of a board next month, a large organization, you know, they've got lots of vendors involved in their processes, and they've been exposed to some of the risks we've discussed. It could be, you know, a striker incident, or more your AI system has had a fault and, you know, you've shared all the data. Where is cyber going over the next 24 months for you? And what are 2 or 3 things you would tell the board to be ready for if that was to happen?
Well, first of all, if I'm an exec, I'd say, are we buying cyber insurance? If so, are we buying enough? Because that's, under penetration for large companies is also a thing, is in there's a protection gap between the events that we've seen occur and what they're actually buying in practice. Secondly, I'd say, does our liability insurance cover AI risk cleanly? If not, let's look into the AI liability. I'd be a bad insurance advocate if I didn't highlight those things. I think secondly, it's less about individual events that are occurring in organizations at the moment and more about that broader AI strategy. So as an exec, if we look at the way that businesses have responded to this, those that have gone early and we've seen mass layoffs with, ultimately, they're maybe regretting it now. Mm-hmm. It was maybe too soon. And I'd even say that for those that have announced these mass layoffs. Okay. But conversely, if you're an executive and you're not identifying the skill sets that are going to have reduced value in this new age, and the people attached to those skill sets, and supporting those people in developing the skills that are going to be more valuable, then you're probably letting your workforce down a little bit. Yeah. So I'd say that's a core challenge. The other challenge is preparation for managing budgets in a very different way. Businesses are going to need to be experts in these models. And the reasoning is because execs are going to be needing to manage headcount, which is predictable, right? You broadly know what you're going to pay people. If you have a little bit of money left over, you might give them a bonus. That's great. But AI models work differently, and execs are going to be juggling the headcount with the token count.
And you can get carried away with it, right? Which you don't in the same way as hiring necessarily.
Well, exactly. You are paying essentially a model for how hard it's thinking. Regardless or not, by the way, of whether that is useful to you as an organization. And so it's a scary thing for execs. We're going to see businesses get this wrong and rely on the most powerful models for all things and end up spending sort of $500,000 against a use case worth 50 quid. I think we're probably going to see some bankruptcies as a result of that. So the businesses that are going to be really well placed here are going to be those using the proportional model for different things. And your finance team might not like it if for all of their finance tools they're using a cheap model. But that might actually be the right proportional thing. If we look at
payoff in the long run.
Exactly. Google's 3.5 Flash model, pretty much at parity with the frontier models on a lot of those financial analysis use cases, fraction of the cost. Yeah. So already we're seeing the businesses that are using these types of trade-offs are going to be getting benefits. So being honest with yourself about, is this actually going to produce all of these savings, or is it just going to risk my margins, I think as a business is the main one, and minimizing that downside risk.
Yeah. I think it's so interesting because just going back to the point that you made earlier about the agreeableness of a lot of these AI platforms, most humans, and I can probably speak for myself on this, are not agreeable in the workplace. Like, they might be wrong, but they will often push back in a conversation, or they might check something. And you can see that with the human in the loop of AI. When you put something, it's like, no, I'm not asking you to agree with me. Can you disagree with me, or raise those options? When you say people have moved too quickly in the layoffs, is that an element that plays into that? Because you're effectively, are you improving your business operations and effectiveness by swapping a human for an AI system?
Sycophancy isn't as universally bad as it was a couple of years ago in the AI
the systems
world.
are better now.
Not universally, but yeah, it's on a model by model basis, right? We mentioned Opus 4.8 earlier. That is less sycophantic than the earlier versions. It will push back, sometimes to almost an annoying degree as a person using it. I think the real opportunity for organizations here is to identify where you do need that human in the loop, and the organizations that went too early maybe, and we saw mass layoffs. That was maybe whilst the industry was still working out where do we still need a human in the loop. And it probably is a lot more of the time than some of those early predictions were foreshadowing.
Mm-hmm. No, interesting. And final thing, I know I said final thing, but we're going to do final thing again. With everyone I sit down with, I ask for one piece of advice you could give the insurance sector. And I've never done that in a cyber incident room because a lot of the CISOs don't want to advise the insurance sector. But what would you say, based on everything that we've discussed and where we're at, let's say a carrier or even a reinsurer, a reinsurance carrier, what should they be thinking about right now that will only help them down the line? And we've probably touched on a few of those already.
It is not a foregone conclusion that we have a thriving cyber insurance market in 10 years' time. It is not a foregone conclusion that we have a thriving AI insurance market, wherever that may sit in terms of exposure across different lines in 10 years' time. Getting to that point is going to require constant product innovation, constant insurers challenging themselves and solving this penetration challenge in cyber and ensuring that we are relevant in the AI space. That means that we must kind of understand the risk. We must push forward into it rather than wait for a large event to occur and the demand to come then. That is the big thing I'd say. And the fact that probably most of those listening to this podcast in that space have some agency in making that happen. Yeah. So we can all play a small role in doing that, and that's probably the empowering part, right?
Yeah,
and it's certainly what drives me.
Certainly not boring. I would argue exciting, but I know that really challenges the boring point. Ed, thank you so much. Really enjoyed our chat, and I think so refreshing and unique take, an open take on AI for the sector. So really appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you for having me.